What's up, everyone? This is Jacob Moses, host of the Not Boring Tech Writer, where in each episode we teach technical writers a different skill so they can enhance their skill sets, improve their marketability, diversify their career, and in turn, prove to their friends, their coworkers, their moms that technical writing is not a boring career. This episode's skill: creating just-in-time documentation. Think about the traditional landscape of documentation. It's often a manual-style feature guide that describes a product's feature more so than an action. It's oftentimes necessary for your knowledge base, but can be difficult to use for the end user and often requires familiarity with the product's terminology. Enter just-in-time documentation, a new methodology of documentation that means creating task-oriented documentation, as our guest today describes, just in time, when the customer asks the question. The perfect supplement to the traditional feature guide. To help me unpack this topic, my guest today is Bri Hillmer, doc coordinator and survey sorceress at Survey Gizmo, who's actually already applied just-in-time documentation for her knowledge base and has had incredible results. So if your current methodology of documentation is having a hard time answering your end users' questions, sit back, relax, and learn how just-in-time documentation can revolutionize your knowledge base. Enjoy. Hi, Bri. How are you doing today?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you. And thank you for taking some time to talk TechCom with me today.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited about it.
Yeah. So I really love this methodology of just-in-time documentation that yourself and Survey Gizmo have adopted, and how it's really changing the process in which you create and distribute content. Before we get into it and share just the power of it with our listeners, let's come to a common ground and discuss the type of knowledge base that probably most of our listeners are familiar with, and that's the traditional feature guide.
Right. Yeah, that's a good idea to get sort of on the same page. So the traditional landscape of knowledge bases, at least from my experience, has been made up of a bunch of feature guide style documentation. So for instance, in Survey Gizmo, we might have a feature that sends emails once a response is recorded, right? Mm-hmm. So that document would be named after the feature, which we call a send email action, a little clunky and weird, right? And it would cover how to use it, any things that might come up while you're using it, right? And there would be that single document out there to cover any sort of questions that might come up about that. So I like to think of a feature guide style document as basically a manual style article that describes the feature for a theoretical user. We typically write feature guides because they're an easy place to start, right? Mm-hmm. They help potential customers learn about features and functionality. And, you know, the other sort of reasons that we end up writing a lot of feature guide style documents, particularly in an agile company like Survey Gizmo, is that documentation is being produced before the feature is released, right? So we sort of try to anticipate, you know, what customers would be looking for when a new feature is released. I also think that a lot of times we write feature guide style documentation sort of as an excuse because we don't really know what customers want. We're guessing sort of that this feature is even something they want. We don't really know what they're trying to accomplish, the sort of the actual user versus the theoretical user, right?
Yeah, and then that creates just that bridge in what customers are actually searching versus what the feature is named.
Right. So that's, if we want to talk about sort of, I think that feature guide style documents have their merit. I think it makes sense to have that kind of content out there, but there are some things about it that aren't optimal. Like you said, it requires sort of this familiarity that you may or may not have. Like I know as a user that I want to send an email every time I get a response, right? I want to receive an email every time I get a response. But the chances that I would look for something called a send email action is really rare. And so you run into this problem where you can't even necessarily get the user to the right content to answer their questions, right? So they become sort of, the knowledge base becomes difficult to search and, difficult to use. Because the other thing that you run into with feature guide style documents is that the sort of cognitive task of interpreting a feature guide style document requires sort of reading through, manual style content, which is, ultimately ends up like you have to read and the task at hand for the user becomes, is this what I'm trying to do? Versus if I just got to a document that said, send me an email every time every time I receive a response to my survey, I already know right off the bat, right, that that's what I'm trying to do. Versus, if I'm reading the manual style article, our example was the send email action. I have to read through it and try to figure out, is this what I want? And then I have to take it and then apply it, and sort of work through the steps and, of setting it up. So it becomes sort of cumbersome for users as well.
Yeah, those specific actions are often buried among lots of different actions in those manual feature guides, and as opposed to just meeting them where they are with the specific action they're looking for.
Right. So that generally, I think, is at least, my understanding of what I would call like the traditional landscape of knowledge bases. And from there, I had known for a long time that this wasn't answering users' questions. I would get feedback from users, or I would get feedback from the support team that, like, sure, in our minds, this feature guide answers all their potential questions, but we weren't getting them to the right content, and then they were having trouble figuring out if getting it to answer their questions and determining whether or not that feature applied to what the task at hand.
Yeah, so this is a great segue. So you're getting this feedback, and you knew that all that content was there in the knowledge base, but users were just having a difficult time finding it. So you came up with the solution of just-in-time documentation. So let's kind of elaborate how you applied that to your KB.
So I think the key to just-in-time documentation is that instead of focusing on what the software can do, the shift in the knowledge base and the shift to sort of how I perceive my task as a documentarian was to instead focus on what I know users want to accomplish, right? Too often, I think when it comes to software documentation, we assume that the features that are in the software are what people are trying to do, and that may or may not be true. Also, in a piece of software like Survey Gizmo that is incredibly complex, there's tons of things that you can ultimately achieve in Survey Gizmo that you would never necessarily have thought of when you were developing the software. So, having users, coming from a perspective where you are instead focusing on what do users want to accomplish and writing that documentation, you ultimately are writing different content and approaching everything much differently.
And I love that too. In our first episode, we had Dr. Chris Lamb, and we talked about design thinking. And that really was sitting down with the end user from the get-go, finding out what their needs are. And in this instance, it was creating a product, but that can totally apply to documentation as well. Right. Is this an action that you want to take? If so, we'll create documentation for it. I love that, Bri.
Right. And then, the additional filter that's applied. So we're thinking about our content purely from a perspective of what do users want to accomplish, and then there's this additional filter that in theory, you only need to write the content that they can't figure out themselves. So, right, like we have a user experience designer here and several software developers that are really passionate about user experience and ease of use. And so, I can rely on them to make a lot of things really easy. I don't necessarily need to write documentation for everything that the software can do. And if I instead just focus on both what users want to accomplish and of that, what they can't figure out on their own, my job is completely different than it was when I was thinking about writing, feature guide style documentation, which I generally refer to now in contrast to just-in-time documentation as just-in-case documentation, right? So it's a complete shift in sort of what do you focus on?
And I like that from a UX perspective. It is nice to have that just-in-case feature guide because it does instruct the end user on what the features are called. And then whenever they're actually digging into the UI, there's going to be that repetition.
Right.
But it needs to be paired with that just-in-time documentation for the specific tasks, as you said. Exactly.
So, my ultimate sort of big picture approach to documentation is that I write, fairly simple documentation that covers, all the features as they get released or, covers existing features. Those are all there because people do expect to have those feature guides either when they're vetting a project to decide whether they're going to buy it or, the marketing team loves them. They do expect them to be there. But then there's this, the majority of my content actually is this just-in-time content that's written based on customer feedback and customer requests.
That's awesome. And then I was looking through your slides, and I'll also make a quick plug, everyone. Bri is actually going to be speaking at the Write the Docs conference in Portland this May.
Yes.
And I was looking through some of your slides, and you said that the richest place for customer feedback was in support tickets. So if someone is interested in applying just-in-time documentation and really finding out the specific actions that end users are wanting to accomplish, how can they dig in? How can they perceive these support tickets?
I think in its purest form, just-in-time is really just actually, I should say, I think that just-in-time in its purest form would be that the support heroes themselves write content in place of responding in a ticket. So if a customer asks about something that's not documented, and as opposed to responding in the ticket, they would actually write the document. But, we're all siloed in our various organizations and whatever. So what ultimately at a high level just-in-time documentation has looked like at Survey Gizmo is just a process that makes it really easy for support reps to send me over requests and content changes. So on the ground, what that looks like at Survey Gizmo is we use Zendesk for our ticketing software. And so it's just a checkbox that says, document this. The support hero can say, hey, I've responded to this ticket, and I think that my response is generalizable, basically, and should be documented so that next time, instead of, me taking the time to write out all the steps to do this, given task, next time I can just say, hey, here's a document that describes, how to set this up. Let me know if you get stuck at any point, right? So they send it over to me, and that basically I have a queue to work from, and I try to respond as fast as possible so that potentially they can even respond to the customer with that document, or if it's timely, they can respond with the document maybe a day or two later and said, hey, just so you know, I let our documentation team know that they, that this would be a good document, and we wrote this up. Let us know what you think. Does this answer your question? So that's sort of what it looks like on the ground here.
And then on the contrary, if it's not generalizable, the support hero will just respond with their custom answer, and no need to get you involved at that point.
Right, right. So they can just keep it moving. They're responding, one ticket after another, and they're just before they, hit send, they ask themselves, do I think this would help other customers? Did my answer here, will it help other customers, and is it not already documented? And they can just simply click a checkbox, and then I use Zapier integration to send that to a Google spreadsheet that ends up being my just-in-time queue that I work from.
I love that.
Yeah, yeah. So it's almost real time. I can see, requests come in throughout the day and decide whether or not to write a new document, decide whether to supplement an existing document with that content. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. So how did just-in-time, this methodology, change the way you stored, categorized, and like labeled documents?
I use a tool called Knowledge Owl. If you haven't seen them, check them out. They're pretty cool. They've changed everything for me as far as being able to do just-in-time documentation.
Awesome.
But, you know, there, for a long time prior to doing just-in-time documentation, I worried a lot about having too much content. I worried a lot about having duplicate content. So, the answer to a specific question in two places that I had to keep up to date. I worried a lot about having out of date content. And since just in time has happened, I don't really, it's a search focused knowledge base now. My understanding of what most people expect from a knowledge base is to be able to search for their specific answer and get a result that very clearly will answer their questions even from the search result page, right? So the title of articles is very different. It's very sort of how do I accomplish X kind of thing. And organizationally, it is something I spend a fair amount of time still thinking about, but I realize that a lot of that is for my own benefit, is like, how do I understand this content to be organized? But I think the average user is not browsing your content and looking for an answer. That's a fairly determined user, a fairly determined documentation user, I should say. Most people search once, maybe twice, and then if they don't get their answer, they're contacting your support teams. Yeah. The other thing that I did for a while with just-in-time, just because like I said, there were a lot of things that I worried about that I needed to get over worrying about, right? It was a significant change in my sort of frame of mind. And so one of the things that I did for a while when I first started just-in-time documentation that I've sort of abandoned at this point was what I wanted when I first sort of decided to launch and just start writing and just churning out content and writing, writing these small little articles that answer very specific questions. What I wanted is to basically be able to hide it from our main navigation. So basically hide it from being able to be navigated to using, browse features, clicking through the site, until I knew that, enough users needed that document.
Oh, so they could search it. They could search for that specific task, but they couldn't click links and navigate to it.
Right.
That's awesome.
Right. So it was like, it allowed me to sort of, continue to work with those concerns and worries about, in a traditional knowledge base, oftentimes you feel that once you publish an article, that article has to stay there forever, right? And it has to be as polished as possible, and you don't really ever have the option of removing that content. And with just-in-time documentation, there's this vetting process, right, where I can look at traffic and say, hey, this seemed like a good idea. This seemed like something that a lot of customers needed, but it just turns out that not that many people are using it, and so I can remove that content. So I use actually another plug for a tool here. I use Google Custom Search Engine, which is I use their paid search engine, and so I have the ability to basically, request that Google unindex an article, and then basically I'm not committed to it anymore, right? So I have this process of determining what content's working and what content isn't.
And in the show notes, we'll include links to all these wonderful software products that Miss Bri is referring to.
Yes. Yeah, so, um, just in time feels, at least to me, like this, like this big change, in practice, really it's just finding a way to get either feedback from customers or from support tickets or from, people in your organization and acting on that feedback, and letting them sort of drive the content that you write. That's pretty simple. It's
Mhm.
really what was the hardest part, at least for me, was just to change my frame of mind about what I document, and what matters and what doesn't. So, another thing that I've decided to worry about as a part, or decided to stop worrying about as a part of just-in-time documentation, is that I don't worry about out-of-date content anymore. Just like I'm writing new content based on what customers tell me they need
Mm.
that's missing, I'm also updating out-of-date content when they tell me, hey, this is out of date.
Oh,
Right.
okay.
Um, so it becomes a really efficient way of, creating a more living knowledge base. It's pretty fun.
That is, and that's a great point. You're creating living documents, and you think about like the traditional feature guide. Whenever a new release does come out, I mean, oftentimes you're spending hours upon hours updating that outdated content because I mean that's all you have. You feel like you have to update your feature guide.
Right.
But with the just-in-time documentation, you've answered the essential questions, and then with the outdated content, whenever if an end user speaks up, then it's okay. I'll fix it. That is incredibly efficient.
Right. And it definitely, it also goes to, help you understand how much of your content, is not really being used, right? Like it's not that big of a failure to have a feature guide that has, the wrong, main navigation steps, or, all of these things that we spend so much time as documentarians making sure, it was always exactly right, is not really that critical.
Hmm.
And I think, a lot of times you can get away with, a fair amount of out of date content if it otherwise feels to a customer like you're working on the knowledge base, right?
Yeah.
So if you have a way of showing them that you're writing new content all the time, if you have a way of showing them that you're writing content that answers specific users' questions, they're going to be a lot less, or a lot more forgiving of out of date content in, say, a feature guide.
Yeah. And since Survey Gizmo has adopted just-in-time documentation, you guys have had some incredible results. Could you elaborate on that for us?
Yeah, so we are our users. We started this in 2014. Actually, I had the good fortune of basically seizing on an opportunity where we released a new version of the software, and so I had to redocument everything anyway. And so I decided to start sort of from scratch using just-in-time documentation. So we've been doing it since 2014, so a good 2 years. We've grown quite a bit as far as our user base, and our documentation views or traffic continues to grow with our user base, but our support is fairly flat. Now, I'm not necessarily comfortable with taking credit for all of that. I think there's a lot of variables that determine how often customers contact you. But I definitely think that, having documentation that really moves with the customers has really helped to keep our support pretty flat. The other thing too, you and I were both at a Write the Docs meetup where one of our colleagues there said something that I thought was really powerful. He said that support's job is to make customers' lives easier, and documentation's job is to make support's lives easier.
Yep. A pool to pull from.
Right? So, I think, in addition to the support, sort of the support incidence numbers being pretty flat, they're also able to handle a fair amount of content, or requests faster, just because of the content that's out there that answers specific questions that users have.
And like you mentioned before, there's not too many very dedicated documentation end users. Well, they'll dig through several documents to find their answer. Maybe it'll be one or two searches and then opt for a support ticket. And
Exactly.
if there is a very accessible pool of documents that support can pull from, and labeled properly, they can snag that and send that to the user quickly. And if not, like you said before, if their question is generalizable, send it off to you and have that for the future.
Right, right. Yeah, I think one of the other same page things that I like to cover when I talk about just-in-time documentation that I didn't when we got started here today was, an assumption that I make about documentation, which is that users generally don't want to use documentation. If they're in documentation, they're already frustrated that they couldn't figure out their task on their own, right? So most people don't want to be there. Most people don't want to browse your documentation. The expectation is if I'm in documentation, I should be able to search and find my answer. And if not, I'll contact support. So thank you for reminding me of that. I don't think everybody thinks that, that the average user doesn't want to use documentation, but I definitely believe that most people don't want to be there if they are there.
As documentarians, we may not want to believe it, but we have to.
Right. It's a necessary evil.
It is. Well, Bri, let's finish off by just maybe dishing out a couple just brief action items that documentarians can apply today to kind of get on that track of just-in-time documentation. Maybe they don't necessarily have the infrastructure to apply it fully, but what's just some action items they can take today?
So I would say first and foremost, it's really just as simple as creating a process that makes it easy for either customers and or support representatives to get you requests quickly. So, and then, beyond that, it's really just about making sure that that's successful. So, communicating to support representatives that it's really important that they do that. Communicating to customers that you're there listening and you're acting on that feedback. So making sure it's a priority. I know we all, you and I both, we rescheduled this podcast a couple of times for dealing with releases, right? So releases of software I always feel like the most important thing. And in fact, I suppose that they probably are, but it has to be a very close second priority to documenting, releases and new features in your documentation. And I think one of the easiest ways to to keep it a priority is to think about your documentation like a product in and of itself, right? So it's not just the documentation of the software that is the actual product. It's its own product, right? So make sure it's a priority. The faster you act, the better, particularly when you want to get something like just in time off the ground. You communicate to customers and or support representatives that you're doing this, and by acting fast, they get that, it's really important to you. You might have to remind people that you're doing it. So I have some people on our support team here that send me, 3 requests a day, and some people that I never hear of. So for a while, when I started Just in Time, I would send out like a monthly email and say, with a list of all the documents I created because of Just in Time. So basically documents that I wouldn't have thought of documenting based on their feedback. And finally, once you start doing something like this, take some time to check traffic to vet that content. So, have a critical eye and say, gee, I really thought this article would be more popular, but clearly is not answering customers' questions, and get rid of content if you need to, or to some extent, if everybody's just searching, you don't really even need to worry about the content out there that nobody's using. Or, you could also look at it as a way to evaluate what content is in here, maybe rename it, or repolish up that content.
I love that. Just really, really adapting to the end user's behavior. That's wonderful.
Exactly. Our job is never done.
That is so. Well, Bri, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today and just really sharing the power of just-in-time documentation. I hope our listeners feel encouraged to try it out.
It was really fun talking with you. I'm really happy to have had the time to talk with you.
Yeah. So let's finish off and just where can listeners find you on the internet if they want to connect with you or learn more about what you're doing at Survey Gizmo, where can they find you?
So you can find me via email at Bri at brihillmer.com. My Twitter handle is WriteBriWrite. And you can also find my documentation, help.surveygizmo.com.
Awesome. And again, for any listeners who are attending Write the Docs 2016 in the beautiful city of Portland, Bri will be there speaking, talking more about just-in-time documentation, and I'll be there as well, and it's going to be a blast. It really is.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. Well, Bri, thank you so much again, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, you too.
Bye, Bri.